Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a minute. My colleague Lee Hanna is going to be joining, so just let me start by introducing myself. My name is Shyla Raghav, and I lead Conservation International's climate change work. And I've been just so thrilled to see all of the positive energy and all of the great conversations that we've seen on Instagram Live today. And I'm just so thrilled to be able to discuss in particular the connection between climate change and COVID-19, and more importantly, how we can really honor Earth Day today by understanding what are the different ways that we can actually come together around a common purpose and unite around a cause that's so important to all of us. So my colleague Lee Hanna is going to be joining in just a minute, and he's a senior scientist at Conservation International. He's been at CI way longer than me. I've been at CI for about 7 years, and we've worked together quite a lot, in particular on understanding how climate change is in particular going to affect species and protected areas. And he's done some really pioneering work on things like agricultural frontiers. So looking at how crops are going to shift with a changing climate. So areas that are growing wine now, for example, might not be able to in the future. So how do we adapt? How do we actually cope with this new reality? And so I'm going to get Lee connected in here right now, and then we're going to kick off our conversation. So I hope everyone's been having a really great Earth Day. Here we have Lee. Hi, Lee. Can you hear me?
Hi, Shyla. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day. I was just telling all of our friends here on the channel about our background working together, that you're a senior scientist at Conservation International, and you've been at CI way longer than I have. I've been at CI for 7.5 years, and it's been such an honor to be able to work with you and learn from you. And I personally have learned so much from you. So I'm sure that our audience here is also going to really be interested to hear what you're going to say and what you're going to talk about.
Thanks, Shyla. It's always great to work with you as well. First things first, I do have a pandemic beard. I realize that's a meme now, but as you can tell, it's not very long, so I'm a late adopter, which means I'll be late getting off the meme train too. So,
yeah, I think all of us have our little quirks or little ways of kind of changing our appearance and our surroundings in the pandemic. You're in Santa Barbara, right?
That's right. Yep. So I'm based at UCSB, or at the moment out of my living room, but under ordinary circumstances, UCSB at the Brent School, which is the environmental school here, and has a great crop of PhD and master's students who we work with a lot as well. So it's always fun to work with young people just entering the field, and I know you see that a lot at CI as well.
Yeah, and you've also spent a lot of your career working in places like Madagascar, right?
Yeah. In fact, the scene on the wall behind me is the pier at Majunga in Madagascar, right across from my wife's family's house. So I spent a lot of time in Madagascar, just got back from there in January before things got really weird. And we're watching carefully what's happening there as well, because so far not many cases in Madagascar, but healthcare system not well equipped to cope. So we're hoping for a few cases.
Well, that's great. So also over the last few weeks, I've seen, Lee, that you've really been able to articulate and define the connections between wildlife and species and human health, right? Like, I think in the past, it's been really difficult for us to understand how are planetary and human health connected? And I think everyone's really confronting that reality right now. Can you tell us a little bit more about why nature and disease are connected or interrelated?
Yeah, well, it's been super interesting because I've known about this field for a while, and frankly, even to me, I work in academia, but it seemed kind of academic to me. But this pandemic has clearly, brought this home to everybody. And what we know is that this particular virus jumped out of wildlife and over into human populations with ensuing untold human misery and trillions of dollars in costs. So it's got our attention. People have been talking about, well, what about wet markets? Even the White House is saying, well, we need to shut down wet markets. And what about wildlife trade? But it goes much deeper than that. There are one or two viruses that jump from wildlife to people or livestock each year. And each one of those viruses is a candidate for a pandemic. And some of them die out early. Some of them, like SARS and MERS, get more advanced. And then others, this one, make it to full-blown pandemic with all sorts of attendant costs. So the connection is that what we're doing with nature and how we handle wildlife is creating a situation in which these virus jumps are increasing every year. So it's not just that we've got one or two every year, it's that we've got one or two and that number's on the increase. And then if you look back in time, say over the last 150 years, we've had 8 major pandemics, all of them linked to wildlife in one way or another, often also linked to domestic animals. But yeah. Wildlife implicated in all of them.
And do you think that, how is it related to biodiversity? So we've also been hearing a lot in this year, 2020 in particular, the kind of the dual crises of extinction and biodiversity loss and climate change. Is the diminishing or the threats to loss of biodiversity also connected to pandemics?
Yeah, definitely. So, and they're all interrelated. So I think one of the things we're seeing is we need to address immediate damages of this pandemic, but then we need to think in the long term about how to build a healthier relationship with nature. And that actually, we've been running numbers on this, and that pays for itself, right? Just the pandemic part of this pays for having a healthier relationship with nature, less deforestation, healthier forest communities. But it also pays that same set of actions, reducing deforestation, as you so well know, pays huge social benefits in climate change reduction. So we've got all this nature out there, forests that are sequestering all kinds of carbon, millions and millions of tons of carbon. And so we want to take care of that. And so in actuality, it looks as if the costs of reducing deforestation to address a pandemic might actually be net negative on a social basis. So we're going to have to outlay billions of dollars to reduce deforestation. But once we do that, we're getting all sorts of other ecosystem services, from clean water to carbon sequestration to help protect from climate change. We get all those as a benefit, and those benefits probably outweigh what we'll actually have to pay in actual budgetary dollars to get deforestation slowed down.
Yeah. So in terms of practical steps, would you say, I mean, we've heard that there's this movement to ban wet markets. You also mentioned stopping deforestation. What are some of the practical actions that governments can take to prevent these pandemics from happening more in the future?
Right. Well, and it's good you bring up wet markets. So people have talked about, oh, we just need to shut them down. But the reality is that a wet market is like a farmer's market in the U.S. So it's not a matter, we've got to avoid very simplistic blanket solutions to this. But we do have to recognize that wildlife trade and trafficking is the illegal part of wildlife trade. Trafficking wildlife puts animals from tropical forests into densely populated centers, and that's just a recipe for disaster. So part of the reason it's a recipe for disaster is that we know that most viruses that can jump to humans and cause human-to-human transmitted diseases like coronavirus are in the tropics. So that's an accident of history or biology or both. And it doesn't really matter why that's true, but it is true that most of the viruses that can cause these problems are in the tropics. And so the link is direct to tropical deforestation.
Okay. And so based on what you're seeing, are you seeing kind of a growing awareness and recognition of this connection? And, based on, do you think that conversation has advanced because of COVID?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, and it's expanded just in my sphere. So now I'm talking to experts at Harvard School of Public Health, people who specialize in emergent diseases, Peter Daszak, who you may have seen in the New York Times or LA Times recently, talking about how we try and discover viruses before we jump. Well, those people all think that we ought to be doing something to prevent the jumps in the first place, which means better managing forests, really.
Yeah. And do you think that governments are going to be more compelled to do something about it now?
Well, I hope so. So before we go there, maybe just talk a little bit. Sometimes this connection to deforestation is a little abstract for people. But what it really is just ordinary people in the tropics primarily going about their business and coming into contact with wildlife. Maybe they keep forest animals as a pet. Maybe they're using forest animals as a source of protein alongside their domestic animals. And you wind up with a situation where viruses can move from wildlife into domestic animals and then into people. And so it's a very intimate thing, but we don't want to broadly paint villains needlessly. You know, wet markets, one part of wet markets needs to get cleaned up, and that's the part where live animals from the tropics are sold. You know, the people selling seafood or vegetables, they're not the problem. So let's think about what a real solution is, which is let's just shut down that part of the wet market that deals usually in illegal wildlife and just get that taken care of. That part we definitely need to shut down. Mm-hmm. And then we need to shut down some wildlife trade. Not all wildlife trade, because some of it's legal. Some of it is wildlife game harvesting in Southern Africa that helps pay communities to keep wildlife on their land. So we need to do that. And then with deforestation, we need to recognize that these virus jumps happen in day-to-day settings near tropical forests. And so what we really need to do is reduce the interface between people and undisturbed tropical forest. It's at that interface that those jumps are likely to happen. Well, how do we do that? We build less roads deep into tropical forests. We give people income alternatives that aren't, you know, forest exploitation or capturing animals to put into the live trade. And that's the real human face on these
So do you think it's about kind of controlling the expansion of kind of urban centers? Is that what would you say to folks that would point to population growth and the increasing need for food? You know, how do we address those dual challenges?
Well, those are complex questions and require some solutions that we're not necessarily really good at yet. We're pretty good at figuring out what a market can do and then turning markets loose on problems. But to address these problems, we really need to balance land use. What's a good land use for a city? You know, where do we want people in the rural landscape? Where is nature most beneficial, providing water or carbon benefits? And how do we, and what we're seeing really is just sort of a random batch of small fragments of people and forest create the edge that allows these viruses to jump over into people. It maximizes the human contact with wild animals. What we need are landscapes that are better designed to minimize that contact. But that's not an easy thing to do. Markets don't necessarily do that for you very easily.
Exactly. So if there's one thing that you would recommend that governments do and one thing that you recommend, you know, companies do, what would be the most critical action that you would say?
Yeah, well, let's start with companies first. That's a quick, easy one. Companies need to look for deforestation-free supply chains. Many corporations are doing this. They need to keep doing that. We need to support that in any way we can with our purchasing actions or with governmental supports. What governments need to do is to come together. There needs to be a global collaboration to try to address the root causes of pandemics. So far we've seen that we have containment measures like testing. We haven't done as good a job as that as we should, but that's a measure we knew about and had funding for and had some supplies set aside for. And then hospitalization, the same. Those are the two main places we've seen investment so far. And then we invest almost nothing in addressing the root causes of pandemics, which is tropical deforestation and wildlife trade. So we we need to shift that balance, invest more in preventing the thing. And then not that it's going to replace these other measures, but we just want to have every possible measure we can have in place, because we've seen we can't afford to let something get through a safety net and hit us full force. We've got to have measures in place, barriers in place to stop it at multiple points along the way.
Yeah. One of the things that's really struck me about addressing COVID-19 has been that it's really forced an integration of the climate change discussion and discourse and human and health, public health, right? And usually, I think in the past, it's always we've struggled to find that connection. We'd say, maybe the rates of cases of malaria or other kind of mosquito-borne or kind of waterborne diseases the frequency of those might increase over time. But here, I think it's so glaringly obvious. Have you also found that this has forced that integration of environmental with development issues?
Yeah, definitely. And, a good part of it's on the environmental side, that people I think all of us didn't really understand how serious this could become. I saw a interview with Bill Gates the other day, and Bill Gates was amazingly calm, given that he predicted that this might happen years ago, had money of his own to put towards it, and couldn't get enough government support to prevent pandemics, all the way from deforestation to vaccines. And he was quite calm and even keeled about it. I might have thrown in a few more "I told you so"s and been a little bit more bitter, I guess, that people aren't listening. Because it's not that, as I talk to the public health experts and the physicians and the disease experts, it's not that people don't know that deforestation is a problem. They know. It's not that we don't know how to identify the viruses. It's not that we don't know how to build a vaccine. We know all these things. They just haven't had sufficient funding. Yeah.
So what would you say could be something that one of our listeners could take as an action item? What can an individual do about this?
Yeah, I think two things, going back to those government and private suggestions. I think consumers can look for once we're able to get into a store in a regular way, and our purchasing can be driven by things broader than immediate concerns. We need to look for deforestation-free supply chains. And, you go into a store these days and you can't find toilet paper, right? But toilet paper is a big driver of deforestation, not tropical deforestation so much. Much of the pulp for toilet paper comes from temperate forests. But that's just another symptom of not quite having a healthy relationship with the planet. Why should we be cutting down virgin forests in the high latitudes in order to supply toilet paper? We shouldn't. We should be reusing other sorts of paper products so that we're not destroying forests to do that. But all sorts of other products have implications for forests, and we need to ask our corporations to look for those and to get them out of their supply chain, which means that we can purchase things without being so worried about how much deforestation it's causing. Yeah. So that's a personal one. And then on the public side, yeah, I think people just need to advocate with their congressional delegations that now is the time to invest in preventing pandemics. We're moving trillions of dollars, and the cost of preventing pandemics is tens of billions, 1 or 2% of what we're moving. We know once we move this money in these relief packages, the focus is going to be on getting back to normal and sort of getting the economy back up and recouping those expenditures. So we really need to move them now. The history hasn't been great about remembering to do the prevention measures that Bill Gates has been advocating, and many others. So let's remember to do it now.
Yeah. And so in aggregate, would you say that you feel hopeful and optimistic coming out of how you're seeing people talk about these things and the deeper recognition that it may have instilled at the individual level?
We've got a teachable moment here, right? People are focused on this. Everybody's really sick about hearing about coronavirus and would be ready for some good news. So the good news is we know how to prevent these. We can't prevent all of them, but we can just greatly reduce them and get out of this cycle of just having to shut everything down and doing huge damage to the economy. So the good news is we know how to do that. We've got everybody focused on it right now. And then we just have to recognize the teachable moments only last a certain amount of time. You know, attention's going to go elsewhere very shortly. Fall elections in the U.S., whatever, other issues all around the planet. So we need to get this taken care of now. And some people in the U.S. Congress are starting to do that, which is great.
Yeah. And I think for me, what I've really also recognized is that COVID-19 has represented almost a shock to the system. And in the past, I mean, as someone working on climate change for about a decade, I've felt frustrated with the incrementalism, right? And just the pace of action, it's just been so slow and it hasn't been commensurate with the scale of the problem. And now what we're confronted with is really that shock, that opportunity for us to really accelerate those solutions and to create a new world, right? To be visionaries and to really be able to use that teachable moment to get accelerated change at the pace and at the scale and at the scope that's needed.
Yeah. Yeah, an analogy is FEMA. So, you know, FEMA has a fund for helping to predict and avoid disasters, which has a lot to do with climate change, in fact. But they put aside a small amount of their budget, and, you know, it's I think it's, you know, $1 pays back $6 in avoided damages. Well, in the case of pandemics, that $1 would be avoiding probably more like $50 in avoided damages. Plus, you get all the benefits of the ecosystem and climate change benefits of the ecosystems along with it. So it's a huge social win to do something about it. So if we've learned something in this, it's that we shouldn't think about all problems in isolation. We should think about how we're treating nature in general and get a healthier relationship with nature. That's going to pay off in a big way for people.
Exactly. Well, Lee, any final reflections or final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I just urge everybody to have a happy Earth Day and, you know, contact your congressional delegation and ask them to get nature and preventing pandemics on the next round of stimulus packages so we don't have to go through this again.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Lee, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. This was really a great opportunity for us to honor Earth Day, to connect with all of you and find our own connection to the planet. So thank you for joining us. Tune in next time, and we hope to be able to continue this conversation over the next few days and weeks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shyla.
Bye.
Bye.